Commercial real estate and residential real estate, fireworks between Katy Perry and the founder of 1-800-Flowers. They are headed to court over a house, a $15 million house. So Carl Westcott, who's the former private equity manager and entrepreneur who founded 1-800-Flowers, says he didn't want to sell Perry his mansion.
The papers were signed. The mansion overlooking Montecito was supposed to be Katy Perry's next luxury purchase. Another multi-million-dollar California deal closed quietly behind private gates. Instead, according to reporting from Fortune and People, the sale exploded into a courtroom fight after the elderly owner claimed he was not mentally capable of understanding what he'd agreed to. And here's the part that makes this story stranger. This wasn't even Perry's first property war. Years earlier, the Los Angeles convent battle already turned her name into the center of a deeply public legal spectacle, according to the Los Angeles Times and BBC. So what kept making these finished deals collapse after everyone thought the signatures were final? The signature that changed everything. Katy Perry, the American pop superstar behind global hits like Firework, Roar, and California Girls, probably isn't the first person you'd expect to see in the middle of a legal fight over mental capacity and disputed contracts. Most people hear her name and think of sold-out tours, television appearances, giant Las Vegas residencies, maybe even those bright, over-the-top music videos that basically defined an era of pop culture. But tucked behind all of that was a property deal so messy that it dragged one of California's most expensive neighborhoods into years of courtroom warfare. And it all came down to one signature. According to reporting from Fortune, Perry and actor Orlando Bloom agreed in 2020 to purchase a massive Montecito estate for roughly $15 million. The property belonged to Carl Westcott, the founder of 1-800-Flowers, and from the outside, the sale looked completely routine. Wealthy seller, wealthy buyers, private luxury estate, signed contracts, closed negotiations. The kind of deal that usually disappears quietly behind gates and legal paperwork without the public ever hearing about it. But this one didn't disappear. Only days after agreeing to the sale, Westcott tried to back out. That's where the story suddenly stopped feeling like celebrity real estate gossip and started turning into something way more uncomfortable. Because according to court documents covered by People, Westcott later claimed he had not been in a clear mental state when he signed the agreement. His legal team argued that he had recently undergone major back surgery and was taking powerful opioid pain medication at the time the contract was finalized. They claimed the medication, combined with his medical condition and declining health, affected his judgment so severely that he should not have been legally bound by the deal. And here's where this case became so tense publicly. Most people assume contracts are final the moment the ink dries. That's how society functions. Businesses, homes, and entire industries depend on signatures actually meaning something. But courts also recognize that there are moments where a person's physical or mental condition matters. If someone truly lacks capacity when they sign, the law can step in. So the entire case started orbiting around one question nobody could comfortably answer without stepping into dangerous territory. If a person signs while under heavy medication or serious medical stress, should the contract still stand? Westcott's attorneys argued no. According to Fortune, his legal team claimed he had been suffering not only from post-surgical pain, but also from symptoms connected to Huntington's disease, a degenerative neurological condition that can affect cognition and emotional stability. From their perspective, this wasn't simple regret. They argued the sale happened during an extremely compromised period of his life, when his decision-making abilities were impaired. But Perry's side completely rejected that version of events. According to reporting from People, her legal team argued that Westcott was fully aware of the agreement and had simply changed his mind afterwards. In legal language, they framed it as seller's remorse, which honestly sounds simple until you realize what's underneath that phrase. Because once the court accepts that argument, the emotional side of the story almost disappears. The issue becomes less about vulnerability and more about whether someone is trying to undo a valid contract because they no longer like the outcome. And the deeper the case went, the more personal it became. Medical records entered the conversation. Doctors were discussed in court. Lawyers dissected timelines, prescriptions, emails, behavior patterns, and mental clarity. A luxury mansion overlooking the California coastline somehow became the center of a debate about cognition, medication, and human judgment. And get this, according to Fortune, the property itself sat in limbo for years while both sides fought over whether the original agreement should even exist legally. That's a brutal place for any deal to end up. Because no matter which side people leaned toward, there was an uncomfortable reality sitting underneath everything. A contract can look perfectly clean on paper while hiding a deeply chaotic human moment behind the scenes. The signatures may appear neat and official, but the circumstances surrounding them can become incredibly messy once lawyers start pulling everything apart. Eventually, the case reached its turning point. In late 2023, according to reporting from Fortune, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Joseph Lipner ruled in favor of Perry and Bloom. The judge concluded there was no convincing evidence proving Westcott lacked the mental capacity necessary to understand the transaction when he signed the agreement. In other words, the contract stood. Legally, the sale was enforceable. And by 2024, ownership of the Montecito property officially moved forward under Perry and Bloom. But wait, the fight still wasn't over. Winning the house only settled the ownership question. And as the legal battle kept growing, the mansion itself almost became secondary to the money, accusations, and consequences piling up around it. How did it get this far? The mansion started bleeding money. The ownership fight was technically over, but the real financial damage was only beginning to surface. Because once the court decided Katy Perry and Orlando Bloom legally had the right to the Montecito estate, another question immediately took over the case. Who was going to absorb the cost of all those lost years while the property sat trapped inside litigation? And in elite California real estate, time is not just time. Time is money, massive money. According to reporting from People, Perry's legal team argued that the years-long dispute prevented them from fully using the estate the way they intended after the original 2020 agreement was signed. The property had basically been frozen while the court battle dragged on. No clean transition, no normal ownership process, just delay after delay while lawyers fought over whether the sale should even exist. Here's where this gets fascinating. Most people hear mansion dispute and imagine the house itself as the prize. But in reality, these estates often function almost like financial assets long before anyone even moves furniture inside. A property that is valuable can generate rental income, appreciate in market value, host investments, and open opportunities that regular buyers never even think about. So every month locked in legal limbo carried a price tag attached to it, and Perry's side wanted compensation for that lost value. According to court coverage from People and Rolling Stone, her attorneys argued the prolonged dispute caused substantial financial harm, particularly through lost rental income and deferred use of the property. The claim wasn't simply, "We won the house." It became, "We lost years of economic benefit while fighting to secure the house we already legally purchased." That distinction mattered enormously. Because once ownership was confirmed by the judge, the legal strategy shifted completely. The first phase focused on consent and capacity. The second phase focused on damages. And damages cases can become brutally mathematical. Lawyers start calculating hypothetical income, market conditions, property use, maintenance complications, and opportunity costs. Suddenly, a home starts being discussed less like a place to live and more like a financial machine that stopped producing money during litigation. Think about that for a second. A house overlooking the California coastline became a courtroom spreadsheet. According to People, the court ultimately awarded Perry approximately $1,842,142.84 in damages tied to the dispute. That number sounds oddly precise because it was. Courts don't usually throw out giant, rounded celebrity figures for drama. They break down losses line by line, category by category, until they reach an amount they believe reflects measurable harm. And honestly, the number itself tells you something important about how seriously the court viewed the delay. This wasn't symbolic. This was the legal system effectively acknowledging that years of frozen ownership carried real financial consequences. The property could not function normally while the dispute remained unresolved, and according to the court's ruling, Somebody had to bear the cost of that interruption. But wait, it gets even stranger when you step back and look at the bigger picture. The original battle started with a human argument about mental clarity, pain medication, and vulnerability. By the time the damages phase unfolded, the emotional side had almost vanished from the public conversation. Everything turned into calculations: rental estimates, market values, delayed possession, financial exposure. The case evolved from a deeply personal dispute into something cold and corporate, almost like the legal system had translated human conflict into accounting language. That transformation happens a lot in high-value litigation. The longer cases drag on, the less they resemble the emotional moment that triggered them in the first place. Eventually, lawyers begin arguing over numbers so large and technical that the original human tension almost disappears underneath financial strategy. And according to reporting from Rolling Stone, Perry's legal team maintained that the extended litigation forced unnecessary losses after a valid contract had already been established by the court. From their perspective, the delay itself became part of the damage. Meanwhile, Westcott's side had already spent years arguing the agreement should never have been enforceable to begin with. So by this stage, both camps were operating from entirely different realities. One side saw a valid deal delayed unfairly. The other saw a vulnerable seller who never should have been locked into the transaction at all. That's why the damages ruling mattered beyond the money itself. It signaled that the court wasn't just recognizing ownership anymore. It was recognizing the financial consequences of resistance after the contract had already been upheld. As reporters and viewers started looking deeper into Perry's history with luxury property disputes, people realized this Montecito war wasn't actually the first time her name had ended up tangled inside a bizarre and deeply public real estate battle. Yes, you had me right. This was about to stir up a controversy that nobody saw coming. The convent that turned into a courtroom. It starts with a quiet property in Los Angeles that didn't look like it belonged in a global celebrity story at all. A former Catholic convent tucked away in the hills, owned by a group of aging nuns who had spent most of their lives there in silence, prayer, and routine. But once Katy Perry entered the picture around 2014, according to reporting by the Los Angeles Times and CBS News, that quiet space suddenly became the center of a legal and moral storm that nobody expected. And honestly, this is where things start to feel oddly familiar. Perry had expressed interest in purchasing the convent property for around $14.5 million, reportedly seeing it as a private estate with historic architecture and sweeping views. On paper, it looked like a straightforward real estate transaction. A buyer, a seller, a price, done. But there was a complication sitting underneath everything from the start, because the ownership wasn't just financial, it was tied to religious authority. The nuns who had lived there supported the sale, according to AP News, believing it would help fund their community and allow them to move forward with their plans. But the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, which held authority over the property, had other ideas. They argued that the nuns didn't have the legal right to sell it independently without higher church approval. And that's where the tension exploded. Because at the same time the religious authorities were pushing back, another buyer stepped into the situation. Dana Hollister, a hotelier based in the United States, moved forward with her own offer to purchase and convert the convent into a hospitality property. Suddenly, the situation wasn't just Perry versus a seller anymore. It became a triangle of competing claims, competing signatures, and competing interpretations of who actually had authority over the same building. Now here's where it gets interesting. According to BBC News coverage of the case, the court eventually ruled that Hollister's purchase was invalid and interfered with the prior agreement tied to Perry's bid. The judge also sided with the Archdiocese's position that proper approval had not been secured for Hollister's transaction. In other words, the legal system stepped in and essentially erased one of the competing deals. But the aftermath didn't settle quietly. The Archdiocese and the nuns became locked in their own disputes over governance and decision-making authority, while Hollister faced legal consequences tied to the failed purchase. And through all of this, Perry's name remained attached to a property she hadn't even fully taken possession of yet, sitting in the middle of arguments she didn't originate but was now fully entangled in. It wasn't just about real estate anymore. It became a question of who gets to decide what a place is worth and who even has the right to sell it in the first place. And maybe the most uncomfortable part of all this is how quickly the public conversation shifted away from paperwork and into morality. Suddenly, it wasn't who owns the building, it was who deserves it. That's usually what happens when a celebrity gets involved. The story stops being technical and starts becoming symbolic. You could almost feel the pattern forming already, even back then. Whether it was a convent in Los Angeles or a multi-million-dollar estate in Montecito, the same tension kept appearing. Authority versus agreement. Signature versus consent. Private contracts are turning into public battles where everyone suddenly has an opinion about what should have been done differently. And get this, according to AAP News reporting on the aftermath, Perry ultimately received a court ruling in her favor tied to damages related to the failed competing sale, reinforcing the idea that the legal system recognized interference in the transaction process. But even that ruling didn't erase the public memory of how messy it all became. So when you step back and look at both cases together, something uncomfortable starts to show itself. When a deal becomes this public, this emotional, and this contested, does it ever stay just about property at all? Or does it always turn into something bigger than the people signing the papers in the first place? When a signature becomes a public trial of power. What ties a Montecito mansion dispute and a decades-old Los Angeles convent case together isn't the buildings, it's the imbalance sitting underneath them, the way wealth, fame, and legal machinery start interacting when one side walks into court with influence and time, and the other side is already dealing with age, health, or institutional limits. And once you start seeing it through that lens, it stops looking like isolated celebrity gossip and starts feeling like a wider conversation the legal system never fully escapes. Here's the thing, that's exactly where Perry's name ended up, not just in one lawsuit or another, but in the middle of a growing public discussion about vulnerable property owners and how real estate disputes can turn into something far bigger than the contract itself. According to reporting from House Beautiful and Realtor.com, conversations around what some commentators loosely refer to as the Katy Perry Act started appearing in public discourse after the Montecito case escalated, framed around concerns about elder real estate transactions and whether additional safeguards should exist when high-value properties are sold under contested circumstances. It wasn't an actual law passed in her name, but more a media shorthand used to describe the kind of legal scrutiny these disputes were triggering. And get this, in Perry's Montecito case with Carl Westcott, legal filings and reporting from People highlighted exactly the kind of tension that fuels that conversation: a high-value estate, an elderly seller, and a contract later challenged on grounds of medical and cognitive condition during signing. Now step back for a second, because when you place that next to the earlier convent dispute, something starts to repeat itself in a way that feels less like a coincidence and more like pattern recognition. Different properties, completely different contexts, but the same underlying friction: authority over ownership, contested consent, and the question of who the law is actually protecting when contracts are signed under pressure, whether emotional, medical, or institutional. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The law is designed to be neutral. It doesn't care if a buyer is a global celebrity or a private investor. It only cares about validity, evidence, and procedure. But in reality, once fame enters the room, the visibility of the case changes everything. Public perception forms its own courtroom outside the courtroom, and suddenly every ruling carries a second layer of interpretation that no judge actually controls. But the truth is usually sitting somewhere in that uncomfortable middle space where contracts are technically valid. But the human moment behind them is still disputed, still emotional, still unresolved in public memory. That's why cases like these don't just stay legal. They spill into culture, policy conversations, and even debates about whether elder protection laws should be tightened when it comes to large property transactions involving vulnerable individuals. According to Realtor.com, discussions around real estate safeguards intensified after high-profile disputes like this brought attention to how easily large-value agreements can become contested after the fact. And here's the part that really lingers. Once a celebrity wins in court, the legal system moves on, but the public narrative doesn't always follow the same timeline. One ruling can close a file while the internet keeps the story alive. reshaping it, questioning it, reinterpreting it long after the gavel drops. So you end up with this strange split reality where the law says one thing, the public feels another, and the person at the center is stuck holding both versions at the same time. The Montecito mansion wasn't hiding anything physical inside its walls. The real shock was the legal machinery underneath it, where a signed $15 million deal, according to people, turned into years of litigation and eventually a court award of about $1.84 million in damages. In the end, the contract survived, but so did the controversy. And that's the part that lingers, because in celebrity property wars, winning in court doesn't always mean winning how the world remembers you.